A word to the wise. We are an explicit podcast tackling content with adult themes as well as entering spoiler territory if you aren't caught up with us. That, this week, would be the entirety of the current Mistborn saga. So Era 1 and Era 2 are on the table today.
Hey there, this is Kross.
And I'm PJ.
And we are Words and Whiskey, a podcast for veteran and novice readers alike. We tackle fiction novels and love to talk about what we're drinking. You should think of us as your intoxicating weekly book club.
We've got a bit of a sequel episode today. It's our full series wrap up, and we've got a guest, and he has been on the show actually fairly recently. What was it for? Was it for
Shadows of Self?
Shadows of Self. Yeah, Bands of Morning was a while ago. Ben, Overly Average Ben, is here.
Hello, hello.
Yes, we're so excited to have you back. I had a couple of guests that were like tentatively booked for like this spot or like an extra episode or whatever, and they weren't getting back to me, and I was like, fuck it, Ben, you want to do it? Because I had slated you in to like come back to talk like post Lost Metal basically, and I was like, you know what, you could have the pick because no one else is getting back to me in a timely fashion, and I'm so excited to have you for this full perspective because you're gonna bring, I don't want to call it jaded, but you've got some takes, and I love takes. So I'm super excited to get into Mistborn Era 1 and 2 with you.
Yeah, I'm ready to bring. I don't know how to describe it either. Jaded may actually be the correct term. I think that may be it.
Perfect. Well, before we go too much further, let's talk about what we're drinking. We'll probably have a pretty quick rundown here, all things told, because for PJ and I, it's in the middle of the day. For you, of course, it's later. So we'll kick it to PJ. What are you having this afternoon?
I have a very complicated cocktail. It has one ingredient. It is just Yellowstone bourbon.
PJ is just sipping on bourbon for lunch. Delicious. Anything to follow that up?
Nope. I've got water.
I mean, naturally, as I hope we all do. Apologies as well. I am ill. I'm going to do my best to cut out all of the coughs and sniffs and everything. And I'm going to be abusing the mute button on my little setup over here. So we'll make sure that as few of those get in as possible. As such, I'm having a hot toddy because that's what one does when they're ill and they need to drink for something, I guess. Yeah, that's the game plan. It's pretty straightforward. Water to follow that up. But in case you don't know what a hot toddy is, lemon, rum, water, brain function, honey, and a cinnamon stick. No tea in a hot toddy.
There's not a tea? I thought it was made of tea.
No, it's generally lemon. Yeah, it's the spice mixture that you get from like cinnamon, and sometimes people use like allspice or nutmeg and other spices like that too.
I'm pretty sure there's at least two teas in hot toddy. To be fair, I think if you spell it, there's at least two.
Maybe in yours,
or I guess it depends. How do you spell toddy? Is that T-O-T-T-I-E?
God damn it, you're right. I just caught the joke, and I am fucking ruined. Toddy is with D's, PJ.
Okay.
But it's not Hod Dotty. So there's two T's in there. God damn it, Ben. I'm on easy mode today, comparatively. Ben, what are you having with us this /PM?
Honestly completely forgot to get alcohol, so I'm drinking Silverbrook Falls natural mineral water.
Damn.
Yeah, so it's intoxicating to say the least, but I completely forgot when I was sat down. I was like, oh yeah, this is a drinking podcast. I can so
not a big deal.
I'll bring more opinions to balance it out.
That's what we like. That's what we like. I was gonna say it totally works because like I'm ill. PJ is in the middle of a work day, and we're all doing our best. So with that, let's kick it off here. So I wanted to jumping into kind of the idea and thought process. Given we last spoke around Shadows of Self for the most part in a recorded fashion, you and I have messaged back and forth about some thoughts in the books in between. I wanted just for you to give kind of your digest on how you felt about the end, the final two books of Era 2 and whatnot, in a sense of like where you landed.
Yeah, I really enjoyed Bands of Morning, actually. Like, carrying on from that, a lot of my main issues still remained, but it was just a much more enticing and I would say just a better story that I was interested in for the entirety of the book. Whereas Shadows of Self, I kind of had to get into that and then it got me along. Bands of Morning was to me the most solid from beginning to end book. And then The Lost Metal was such an experience. There are things that I loved about it. There are things that I felt completely out of. There are progressional things that I wasn't too sure about. I still feel like I'm processing how I actually feel about it. But overall, I land on the Era 2 just wasn't written for me, and that's okay.
I think that obviously you haven't listened to the episode that hasn't came out at So Naturally, exposing you to our takes. I think that we landed in similar places, especially when I first completed the book, and I think PJ too, where we were like, I was like, wow, that was really good. That was really enjoyable. And then I sat and thought about it for a little bit and I was like, okay, but was it though? Like, was all of that as good as I wanted it to be? And then on a second read, I really started to analyze, and a lot of my opinions that I liked in the first read flipped by the time I was done with the second read, where it's like I liked the other thing way more than I liked the former thing. Obviously, we're full spoilers. PJ and I talked about this last week, but like initially I was like, oh, Marisu's plotline, interesting, a little bit crazy in terms of things, but wow, I kind of liked where that was. And then the second read, I was like, this is almost, you could completely excise it and you'd almost have the same story. And that made me go, all right, maybe I don't like that. And then I liked Wax and Wayne's End better. And it was weird. It's a weird experience.
Yeah, like Wayne has been my least favorite character out Era 2 out of the kind of general, if I was counting 4 as the main characters, Wayne is by far my least favorite. And he had the best end. And I was like, it's such a strange, I finished it and I was like, why do I feel emotional for a man I've despised? It's kind of like if you have a bad relationship with a grandparent and then he passes away and you're like, why do I have he was the worst. He was an arsehole. I'm still there. I'm like, for some reason now his sexist humor, it has a nice place in my heart, but it shouldn't have. What happened? I hated him.
I mean, to be fair, like I completely understand where you're coming from with that, but that ending is him getting obliterated. Like,
maybe that's why I enjoyed it so much.
Just murdered.
Vaporized.
That could track. PJ, if you wanted to sum up your feelings, I know that I just ran through mine. I know that they're mostly similar, but you had some other thoughts and things. Also because we haven't read Stormlight or the other relevant story.
That's true. I think I enjoyed the book. I think I really liked it. There are just those few gripes, some of the things with Marisi being the big ones. Maybe it's, I don't know. I enjoyed the book. I had a great time reading it, but I enjoyed it more at the beginning of the book than towards the end of the book, I think. Kind of devolved a little bit.
Yeah. Just had to get things done, had to tie it up. But even then, did it. So, like that's one of the bigger things with me is like, did we even really complete the book the way that I feel like would be satisfactory in a lot of fashion? Like there's so much. The hot take that PJ and I both came away from our wrap up of The Lost Metal was that you could almost completely cut out Bands of Mourning and have a lot of the same sort of threads work, especially through The Lost Metal, because all of the cool things, for the most part, outside of the Almantic grenades that are brought up in The Lost Metal, are dropped because they're meant to be Era 3 fodder. And so you don't need them, and it would have been more satisfactory all over. That said, I do really like Bands of Mourning. Like, it's still a very good book, but it's just like, one of the two of these are unnecessary, and I'm not sure which it is, because some characters' plot lines resolved in bands, and like they were just kind of along for the ride by the time we got to Lost Metal, and yeah.
I honestly think that Era 2 could have been a duology and would have been much better in terms of like at a pacing level, a story level, because there felt like a sense of like a sprawling piece of thread that he didn't quite know how much to let out or how much to keep in, and so it just kept on bloating to a point. And one of my big gripes with this series is kind of goes beyond, especially in Lost Metal, it goes beyond into kind of further Cosmere, is purely that I think there was too much progression in Era 2, kind of technology wise and society wise, that I'm just kind of like, how can the next series go further without completely disleveling how everything works. And I mean, even on one thing I was thinking, it's about 2/3 of the way through, I was kind of like, I feel bad for the people that read Bands of Mourning when it first came out and have waited 5 years for Kelsier, and he sits on a fucking chair.
Oh my God.
He does nothing. He's not in the story.
Worthless.
And I'm like, I get that you've replaced that with this kind of like all these cool characters that are doing something, but also like, what was the point? Like that is my takeaway from Era 2 is like, what was the point? Like, that's, I feel really bad, but I do. Like, luckily I've now read Tress of the Emerald Sea, and I really enjoyed that in the sense of like, okay, if this is where we're going, I'm okay following it. I just felt like Mistborn Era 2 was ironically a misfire, that now that we've been given guns, he did not know how to use them evidently and misfired all over the place. But,
yeah, wet powder. Yeah, we similarly love Tress. I thought Tress was bound to be. We'll try not to spoil too much of that here because we, for people who maybe haven't gotten their hands on it yet. But Tress for me was like almost a 10 out of 10 until like as a fable in this fairy tale until the end, and then that knocked it down a couple of pegs for the aforementioned kind of reasons and rationales. But it still felt good enough. Like it still felt great. It just wasn't. I wanted it to be, I don't know. I wanted like that Peter Pan fable, Princess Bride fable capturing, and we moved in a direction. I was like, all right, that's fine. But that was me.
I love Tress.
I also loved it for the record. It was an 8.5. Like,
book.
That's great. That's great. But yeah, I was so up on it. And I got like just the smallest letdown. And I was like, okay, that was good. Yeah, you're right though. Especially that, oh God, there's something that's so tangible about Kelsier in the story that makes me, like in the whole story, in the whole of the eras, that is perhaps my biggest problem with Mistborn is its attachment to Kelsier. So maybe we should just hop in there because I did want to talk about this at some point. I don't know, Ben, that we've talked about it, but I despise Secret History. I hate it. I think it's the worst. I think it's the worst thing that I've read of Sanderson's, except it's really just one chapter that's the worst part. It's part 6, and it's most of it. And it destroyed character arcs for me in a foundational way. A lot of character agency, for instance, like Marsh building up the momentum to like being able to, pull away from Ruin. And the only reason that Ruin's distracted enough to do it is because Kelsier, Big Brother, was working in the background, or Little Brother was working in the background, so Big Brother could break free for a moment. It steals so much agency from that and from Spook, like leaning on him metaphorically versus leaning on him physically, that it's like, oh my, I don't literally need, I don't know. I had big issues with Secret History myself. So I was disappointed, to say the least, doubly disappointed when Kelsier wasn't really utilized in The Lost Metal. If he's going to be this big plot thread that you want to bring through, all right, make it fucking matter. And then it didn't.
Yeah, that is because I enjoyed. I listened to the audio, which I don't usually do, and I enjoyed the story in of itself. I was kind of like, it's an addendum that if it pays off will be great. And then I don't feel like it's paid off, and I feel like it's actively outside of Mistborn disrupted and destroyed other characters' plot lines as well in other series as well. Like, we won't get into it, right. But for people that know, this series answers so many questions that were never asked in this series. It was asked in a different series. And now I'm like, where they're going to have absolutely no agency in the other series, or it's that we don't need to, or we're just going to retread. That's another big problem I had in this series, is that we have a lot of retreading through different series and characters, paralleling other characters, doing directly the same things. Like,
yeah, it's like an identical plot line.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I enjoy Tress so much, because I'm like, okay, keep doing this. Like, you've somehow got into the habit of, like, the idea of founding a democracy. Like, Elend already tried to do that in Era 1. So why are we having Wax and everyone do the exact same thing? Like, I enjoyed the idea of Wayne going, oh, I'm going to try to do like philanthropy and stuff, because we haven't seen that before. But when we've got Wax, who's unfortunately kind of dry as he is as a character, then being like, I'm going to retread other people's plot lines. I'm like, then please leave. Just go back to other people for a bit.
And I think to sort of stack on top of that, it's not even that it's entirely like retreading those plot lines. It's doing it and explicitly saying that it's doing it. Like it's referencing those plot lines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Specifically when you get into Marasies right at the end here, we talked about this in an episode, but it gets really explicit as opposed to something that can be figurative and we can imagine it. We could be like, oh my God, the way that she burnt the pool of investiture in that moment was so similar to when Ellen did it, but to like literally bring it up 3 times within the span of the same pages to make it a direct, like, hey, just so you know, this is basically the same. Like, did you know? It's just like not trusting your readers to draw those connections. And I've never felt more talked down to by a book than the times when that happened at the end here. And that's a gripe, but it's not, not crazy. But I was like, man, trust us to put it together. We're not dumb. Mm-hmm. Like an executive maybe, but like, because they're just reading the highlights. So I did want to talk a little bit. This gets us actually, I think, comfortably to a point of retreading, having this conversation. I want to talk about Era 1 versus Era 2 and kind of like thoughts on the whole things, how they compare now that both are kind of done. Ben, you gave some kind of overall thoughts on where you land on Era 2, but just sort of the way the moving of technology, this idea of like, what does this mean for the grandiose kind of story of Mistborn as it proceeds through eras and ages, and what you think, I guess, on the whole, characters, everything. So
I'm a big Era 1 stan. I love every single book in that. I read them as a kid. I reread them. And I think the best way to describe it is that if I ever do a big Cosmere reread, I will probably skip Era 2 because depending on how good Era 3 is, I don't feel like there's anything in there that may not just be like, oh, I remember what happened and just skip it. In terms of like Era 1, I love all the characters. I love all of the progression. I think on almost every level apart from prose, I prefer Era 1. I think Era 2 has a more unique voice for Sanderson. I don't necessarily like all the voices, but I do think you can see his development in that. But yeah, I'm an Era 1 through and through kind of person.
I think you fit along pretty well with us in that regard. I feel very, very much the same way. One thing that I feel like is done much better in Era 2 are the interpersonal relationships and how they're written. Like that just feels much more mature. It felt very glossed over in the first book, but the characters themselves in the first series are, I like them a lot better. I don't know.
I feel like Era 2 took the characters from Era 1 and made me not like them. That may be a strong statement, but I remember when we did the conversation, we talked about Sazed and being like, oh, I'm so excited to see where that character goes. And I feel like, once again, this is just a kind of middle ground to get to Era 3, where I'm kind of like, we didn't invest enough in them. And instead, I kind of hated that they had no agency. I really hated Tensoon. The way he acts in Lost Metal, he's just like, oh, sorry for not helping. I didn't really think about it. Like, he kind of,
you're kind of
and I'm like, This is Tensoon. Like, what's happened? Why is he just stood there like, whoopsie daisy? Probably should have thought about that. I'm like, what are these people doing? And the Kandra is so cool. And the Kandra work great as I love the villain from the Shadows of Self. I'm like, the Kandra have so much potential that I just felt like Tensoon, that we didn't explore enough to see whether is it an effect of the decay of not whatever. Is there anything going on with him? But instead, it's just he just turns up, does nothing, and then leaves. And I'm like, oh. And I felt like that happened a lot, where like Marsh would turn up. I'm like, oh, nice to see him. Oh, he's gone. And then says it. Oh, it's gone on with him. Bye. And it was just everyone was coming in and out, and I felt like I had no strong grasp on where they were at, other than they're not in this story. Stop thinking about Era 1 for this bit because this is Era 2, but we have to bring up Era 1 so you remember that it's part of Mistborn. And I just wish we had a bit more cohesiveness in the characters from that are being brought back.
Yeah, speaking of that, something I wanted to bring up, and I'm not quite sure the best way to word this question because I didn't write it down. Milan is a pretty drastically different character in Era 2. Do you think it made sense to have it be Milan, having grown up and grown out of a lot of the sort of rebellious phase of her life? Or do you think it would have been cleaner to have a different Kandra?
I haven't actually thought about that. I kind of, with Milan, I didn't feel too strongly either way. And honestly, I think it's because they just feel like two separate characters that sometimes I even forgot to relate. I was kind of like, well, this is just what they're like. That I feel like maybe it's just that I didn't even comprehend that there is a big difference.
Yeah, I think for me, I think I like Milan's inclusion here because to Ben's point, what you were saying, there's this whole issue with Era 2 where it's like it's almost not exploring at all, despite it being like the explorer's age, the sort of age of law and like the Wild Wests. We spend so much time of a Wild Wests story in a city, in a big city, as opposed to kind of out on the roughs, which was sort of the promise and the premise to me from the outset. And it just kind of feels, because we don't really go out that direction nearly as much as I thought we would, it's like we're not really exploring the world. Similarly, or actually less similarly, I feel like the one thing that we do explore pretty effectively is the Kandra and their relationship with Sazed between Pa'alm and Milan. I think that them in particular, we get a good picture. Vendel as well, and a little bit of Tensoon. Tensoon is more still like a chief spy, but he's like barely, he's not really there that much. But I feel like that's the one of the things for me that Era 2 absolutely nails is the exploration of Kandra in different ways than I ever would have imagined between Milan and Leslie Pa'alm. So I like her inclusion. I think that, it works. She does kind of feel like a different character, but I think that that's what 300 years might do to an immortal, is you might grow and change, and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. That's fair.
She still is kind of a rebel. She kills people when some of the other Kandra refuse still. So,
right.
What do you think, EJ?
I'm not sure. A lot of the time I felt like it was mostly a vehicle to let the readers know that like these are the same Kandra as before. Like they're still around, but the character itself didn't feel like it had any through lines for the most part.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I also think it's reasonable to say that a format of our podcast is I like to focus on things that I know are going to come up in the future. And so I definitely put a lot of focus on Milan, who is otherwise a small part in all of Era 3, because I was like, oh, she's going to come up. We should definitely be talking and paying attention to her more than I think an average reader may even initially key into on a first read. So I think that was something that I appreciated between it, is like you can see a lot of those notes that we do get in Milan, but it's as though they've grown, matured, blossomed. I will say I've got mixed feelings on Milan's end in this era. Not that she's done or anything like that. She feels like she is definitely going to be continuing for a number of reasons. But it, again, feels like a waypoint less than it does like a full story arc. So even for her, especially for her, and for Sazed, and for Marsh, and for Kelsier, of whom are apparently all going to be very important for the rest of this story, which is also like, at a certain point, it's good for legends to die. And that's a good thing for the foundation of a world. And I am kind of losing it still over the idea of Kelsier actually being back and playing such a major role in the story versus letting other characters have agency. And I didn't like Kelsier that much to begin with, so I'm just grumpy about it.
So we had a conversation regarding Era 3, and having thought about it more since we last recorded, I really think Era 3 is going to be a very short time jump. Like, I think we might be able to see that resolution of Kelsier and Marsh fairly quickly if Kelsier is able to convince Harmony, Sazed, to sort of fast forward the technological advancements of the world, like they were talking about in the epilogue.
You don't think that like there's going to be a fight that's coming at the very end of the Cosmere where Hoyd and Kelsier are going to be standing on the precipice of the 16 shards coming back, and they're going to have lightsabers and they're going to swing at each other, and Kelsier's going to fall and Hoyd's going to win and become God? Like, that's not your... Because I'm pretty sure that's what's fucking happening. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like we're only going to have a couple of decades jump between Era 2 and 3.
Yeah.
Like, I think that, like, evidently they're all going to still be alive, but I think they'll be older in the sense of they'll be new, but I like the idea that they'll at least be fucking alive. I hope that it's 100 years down the line, but between stories, Wax turned into a fucking ghost man and he's here. And I hope it's at least if they're just there and they're just kind of old. The thing that scares me a bit, the only thing that makes me scared about that is the idea of having a younger characters kind of being like, oh, you know, they're old. They're saying some bad stuff, but they mean well, you know, they're just old. And it's kind of, I always hate that narrative of the sense of, you know, they're saying bad jokes, like stuff you can't say anymore, but that's okay because they're just a bit old. And I feel like that seems like what Sanderson may do with like a Wax type character. Come on, Grandpa, you can't just shoot people, like an Indiana Jones type situation. I hope that doesn't happen, but I'm also kind of scared that it may do. But yeah, the progression of the entire Cosmere frightens me to absolutely no end. And I think the issue is that because we're seeing progression so fast and so much progression, is that those that started, for instance, like with Mistborn, with Stormlight, with everything, where it's more down kind of not generic fantasy, but what you would typically expect from fantasy is that it's limited technology wise. You've got magic systems, etc. And I kind of don't like the idea of starting people out with that expectation and then going, okay, well now you have to be in for a sci-fi, because if you're not in for a sci-fi or a modern fantasy or a technologically advanced like sci-fantasy, then you're not going to enjoy any of the Cosmere, and that's down to you. You know, you've bought 16 books, but I've decided the progression's happening, so you're done for. I kind of don't like that. I feel like that is, especially the way he kind of talks about the idea of like, it's not magic, it's just science and stuff like that. And I really liked some of that in the beginning, but now it's kind of like, no, magic doesn't exist anymore. It will feel like magic, but we're going to describe it like science. And I'm like, you are removing, for a lot of people that enjoy reading your series, you're removing the magic quite literally. Like, and I think there's something dangerous in the sense of moving forward and having other series that all tie together that eventually have to progress and be on a level playing field, that the entire thing's just going to feel like a sci-fantasy that it never was originally. That's just my fear.
I'm in the same camp, and I think that the thing here that differentiates you and I from PJ in this moment is having read Stormlight, because there is something that is very foundational about that story that functionally in my brain does not work if it were to progress this way. I've mentioned to PJ a couple of times, and we've talked about it off air, I am a fan of The Lost Metal as a book if it's an outlier, not the norm. And so if it were to shift to becoming the norm, I could not continue reading. Like it will be a quick DNF and no more for me, because it is, while interesting on its own as this sort of intersection of things, and I know that things at the end are going to intersect. I made the joke about the Hoyd Kelsier battle. It's fine to culminate into something really big like that. Like that's cool, and that can be well executed, and I'm not worried about that. But I am afraid of like the book to book sort of expectations or needs to like read this in the like publication order, and then the sort of escalation of things, and especially of technology, where it feels like, you know, you said like losing the magic. It's not just magic for science, it's losing the sort of mystery of it all. If I can piece it all together, why am I reading the book as opposed to reading a summary? And this gets into the like journey before destination, sure, that only works for so long, where it's like, if the payoff isn't worth it, then, you know, the journey can be shit too. Like you just don't realize that it's shit until you're there.
Yeah.
But yeah, yep. Those, I totally agree with you. I'm in the same boat where it's like, I hope that this is a waypoint, a stopping post, something different in an experimentation, not a path forward for the primary series. I see this eventually culminating in that direction. So eventually it's going to take that turn. That's okay. But you gotta still keep it fun and interesting. That's where like Aethers come in, and it's like, ooh, there is a sense of like different magic, and there you can still spice it up at the last second. Not worried that way. Tress eased me a lot on my fears on the Lost Metal, I'll say, because I had basically that take, but harsher after reading the Lost Metal, and Tress like pulled that back a little bit to be like, okay, we can still have fun while progressing.
So I just want a little bit of clarification from this stance. Are you like talking about them like when Marasi talks about how allomancy to her is science as opposed to magic? Or are you talking more about them sort of blending technology and bombs and things into the allomantic system?
I mean more the actual describing magic as science. So the idea of like the way it's kind of like when the people turn and like the people from that are with Marassi and they're kind of like, I enjoyed the banter of the idea of like, well, no, this isn't magic. Like, this is just what we're like on our home planet. Like that I was fine with. But when it comes down to like, I thought that was funny. But when it comes to the idea of like, I don't know how to describe it. It just feels so clinical. And the best way to describe it is when they are putting the two types of metal and they trying to split it. And the thing I had a problem with there is I'm like, you've made the allusion to real life too absolutely 100% blatant. Like the idea of splitting it, I'm like, it's so clear that you're talking about the idea of nuclear power. You're creating a rocket that can like cause mass destruction. It's so absolutely on the nose that you're like, you ever heard of Oppenheimer? Like that's what we're doing here. And it's kind of, like, that's why I had a problem where it's like, I don't need to have someone explain why my man can jump on a coin and fly up. He just ingests the metal. Like, that's all I need. I don't need someone. And unfortunately, once again, won't go into it, but there are scenes that are similar in other places in the Cosmere that I was like, I was reading it. I'm like, oh, this would be really cool if I haven't read this exact scene before in a different place. And that is that is just something that's unfortunate with Era 2 is I just found myself thinking, this was cool when that happened in that book and it happened in that book and it happened in that book. And that it builds up and it's that removal of the magic that I'm just like, oh, yeah, we've entered the nuclear age, but we were just in the cowboy age. Like, I know there wasn't that much time between. There was a lot of progression. I feel like you should save nukes for Era 3 maybe.
Yeah. So, for the record, I just want to clarify, PJ, before you react here, because I know exactly what you're going to hop in on, because you think that this is a feature, not a bug. But I think the technical issue is the sort of clinical description of it, as opposed to like a more natural explanation. It feels like we're going into these conversations of it just being, we're going to experiment with this. And Brandon already knows the fucking results. Our characters feel like it's already a foregone conclusion before you approach some of these scenes. And that's the issue with the way that it's written, both here and in Stormlight. We'll just say it because like there's only one other book series that we haven't talked about. But that's one of the issues, is that like Stormlight, it feels like an exploration. Here it does not. It is an explanation. And that is completely different. And that's why this is so jarring, even though it's already been done. Oh God, yeah, totally fair.
I for one though just really love the get into the nitty gritty, like give me all of the very very specific understanding of how this works and why. So, but that's me.
I genuinely. I'm sorry. Go ahead. I genuinely think I would have completely been on board and loved it if there wasn't that allusion to things already happening elsewhere. Because it was only when I finished that scene, I was like, that was cool. That reminded me of the exact same thing that happens.
Of that 300 pages that happened over the course of a book.
Yeah.
That wasn't just digested in a single scene. Yeah.
Yeah.
Me too. About that scene, I'm very grumpy, and I've not been allowed to be grumpy on the show, but I'm doing it now. So, yeah. Ben, I'm so with you, and I think it is because of the exposure difference, right? But that's kind of the concern. I'm glad again someone gets it, because I see so much like positive love for this book, for the Lost Metal in particular. I know we're talking about the eras comparatively, but it's hard to not talk about the immediate thing. And I straight up don't get it, because like I do really enjoy the book for the characters. I think that this book is the best character work outside of Marassi that any of the series explores, but it's, I don't know. I have a tough time.
I feel like for me, it's one of those that when we read Era 3, I think Era 2 will feel like when someone wrote a story and then was hired to write a prequel for their series, and then they come up with Era 2. But we're doing it the opposite way round, where they're writing this story that feels like had to fill the time. like I had to write a prequel, so I wrote this, but they're doing it before what is it, the actual story.
And everyone's defensive of that thing of like Era 2 not being that good is like, well, it wasn't planned. And it's like, it's not about it being planned or not planned necessarily. Like, you can still make a story satisfying without, you know, I fully disagree with that notion being why Era 2 stands out as this sort of negative mark on Mistborn and the future of it. It's just choices that were made to broaden the scope too much, to make it feel like the world is ending. It could have been small stakes. Shadows of Self is so good to me because it has small stakes, because it introduces this different angle on immortals and like wanting freedom from an oppressive force, and like this idea that like it's just humanity, but on a longer time scale. And that's, we get those comparison points of stress and pressure in everyone else's life too. And it's just, yeah. Anyway, we should have gotten more of that. Bands was great too, for other reasons. Cool. All right. PJ, did you have more? You looked like you were going to.
Nope.
Okay, cool. All right. So we talked a lot about Era 2. I would love to chat a little bit about Era 1, just the way we can kind of get the boxing match going. There's a lot to love about this series in general. I mean, the first trilogy of books does a wonderful job introducing the magic system, giving us kind of an initial basis of shards that we didn't really kind of understand until much later in Cosmere readings to some degree. We get some wonderful characters, and we sort of get this foundational understanding of like where everything is going to go from here on this like Earth equivalent world. I'm curious about how now, much later, you know, Ben, for you over, I think you read this basically at publication or shortly thereafter, how we feel about it now that we're out of Era 2 and we think about these characters and some of the relationships they're in. Do you feel like there's anything that you think that like Brandon would go back and change? What do you love about it? What's your love of Era 1?
Oh, of Era 1. Hey, Era 1.
Yeah.
Era 1 would definitely, I know that he has publicly said that he would make Era 1 less brutal and bloody, because he believed that he was falling into, because Grimdark was so popular at the time, he was putting in things that are quite graphic that he wouldn't necessarily have put to begin with. I disagree. I think that all that stuff's great. I think the treatment of the scar is perfect. All that darker element needs to be there to have the stakes of a literal dictator. Like, you have to have it be shown as a dictatorship, otherwise you don't care about the adversity that they're overcoming. So I love, first off, I love the exploration of theology in Era 1. I love the exploration of theology in pretty much everything he does. But especially in Era 1, when I first read it, it was like groundbreaking to me to be like, well, this is such an interesting concept of how Kelsier, like on a reread, Kelsier's kind of transcendence to being a martyr is so well realized in the plot, and how his character acts throughout. It kind of really, for me, it bolsters that book up. I think my favorite thing about Era 1 is the way that the book 1 is a story on a personal level, is a story about a small group and what they're doing. Book 2 is the progression to them trying to look after a city. Book 3 is them saving the world. There is a linear progression and scaling up of that series that each time Vin gets more powerful, each time every character gets more powerful, you feel like you've had a build up and a progression with them. That I think that's really well handled in Era 1. So I think if I'm highlighting anything, it's that on a planning and structure level. I think the way that the book levels up each time is really well handled.
PJ, what do you think?
I think that was very, very well said. And to piggyback on that, the threats of each of the books are realized and detailed and tangible, and there's a great sort of climax to them. All of the different all the different conflicts within that story, and that feels less of the case, especially towards the end of The Lost Metal, where the big threat of the men of gold and red just don't, like, it's just shut off by like a certain amount of luck. And
we weren't even talking about that plot hole.
Yeah.
Or gap, vacancy, whatever way you want to put it.
Telsin feels like she falls flat in sort of a climactic, antagonistic showdown. Like all of it, the Malwish are just kind of dangling there. like we talked about. And there doesn't feel like a really satisfying, the good guys overcame the bad guys moment, unlike Era 1, all throughout it.
Yeah. Era 1, if nothing else, is very distinct villains. I mean, we start off the story with Kelsier. We then go to like the Lord Rulers, this other big bad that follows up Kelsier, of course, and then Straff, Zane. Like, we've got all these great evil dudes. I'm so sorry. It's obvious that I have an issue. I think I agree with you both. Like, one of the things that I love the most about Era 1, and Era 2 begins to explore it, and then again drops it in the 11th hour with the Lost Metal, is the exploration of philosophy, or of theology, and in tandem, philosophy leading to theology, and like this sort of like basis in the way that shifts. And I find it so interesting and so fascinating. And then it drops off the cliff in the Lost Metal, like it's not even a component. We have to instead focus on the shards, which are the real gods. And there's something about taking away intangibility that upsets me about Era 2, I think, most of all. Something about making the tangible so real. Not that there's too much exploration, or there's too much explanation as opposed to exploration and trying to get these things gradually. So yeah, I think that Era 1 just nails the tone. I think most of all, like you said, Ben, I don't think I would want to undo a lot of the violence and the way that like Vin goes after being convinced with Zane to like murder an entire army. Like it's so important to her character development to be like, oh shit, I don't need to be the weapon anymore, or not this kind of weapon. And I can't imagine changing it. Yeah. It's good. It's meaty. I think at the end of this, I did originally, when we started this project, I liked Era 2 more. And that should say something about the way that I feel about the Lost Metal, despite liking it as a book. But now I'm definitely full in Era 1 camp again, despite Secret History. I'm just pretending that that's not canon. So
I feel like the big difference is that scene you mentioned of Vin, where like she goes and she decimates that entire like building. And then the difference between that, where you're physically shown the idea of being this like the way you can go, and then you've got Wax being like, maybe I don't need to be the weapon. Maybe I don't need to be the sword. And I'm like, shut the fuck up, Wax.
I don't need to do it.
Yeah, and I was just like, have you thought about doing this in a less cringe way, Wax? Have you thought about? It felt like a high school kid kind of having these morality issues that I just wasn't invested in with him. Where I was like, have you done anything like in the sense of what does he mean by that? For me, it's kind of like you've been a weapon in justice, but you have arrested people. Like, not every one of your cases, I hope we're only seeing the ones that go badly, where you're accidentally like killing people. I hope this isn't every case that you're going out and murdering people. I hope you just sometimes go out and just arrest people.
ACAB, like,
yeah, like, and it felt like the idea of like, I don't need to be a weapon anymore. I'm like, right. What have you been doing off screen, Max? What have you been murdering?
He does talk about, like, in the roughs, it was very much shoot first, ask questions later. And
that's true.
He seemed to me more like a bounty hunter than a constable, the way that job was described. But
I feel like then we didn't see enough of it. We only had a prologue there, is then the issue.
I want bounty hunter Wax. Like, I need to feel that to see it actually in his shoes to some degree, to give it the emotional weight that it needs, right? You can't just, this is like a common issue with writing, of course, is like, you can't just say that this character was one thing often. You have to prove it in some way, shape, or form. And the couple of little, this is the way that the story was told, of course. And so, like, it is what it is. But at the same time, only telling us and showing us those things in flashbacks and then having them mostly be harmless, as opposed to like needing to go through and like physically do these things, I think is a kind of letdown of the series for me, to some degree, of like of Era 2, I should say. It's like, I want that bounty hunter. We should see a little bit of that. Alloy, if we restructure Era 2, Alloy of Law takes place entirely in the roughs. Entirely. Nowhere near Ellendale. Shadows of Self, we bring it in to be like a detective from out of town. Bands of Mourning is the final book that is this Indiana Jones adventure back out to the roughs. And you're done. And the Lost Metal does not exist. And I think that's a solid story.
I genuinely 100% agree with you. And that's what I've been thinking in my head the entire time. I'm like,
Yeah.
That would be, because I remember talking about the issue in Shadows of Self that I never felt invested in the fact that we start Wax at such a high level of being at his, ironically, lowest point, and then we're having to build up from there. And why are we having stakes when he's already so low?
Yeah.
That would change it, where if you have book 1 end with that horrific moment, have book 2 be the reveal that happened, book 3 coming over that and realizing that he still needs the help and everything and stopping his family. That is an actual story about the characters that are in the trilogy. At that point, it would be a trilogy rather than this is a story that transcends. These are the characters we need to facilitate to get them to the climactic ending that helps me propel the series going forward. It's plot manipulation versus character growth naturally, which is also why we prefer Vin's arc. This is why we're talking about this to begin with, is like Vin's is concrete and we see this gradual escalation that makes sense. Where in Era 2, it's like it's disconnected stories. And some of that's the symptom of the way that it was written, which we can definitely understand. Like, I can definitely understand as to why it feels that way. But, oh, man, do I wish it was the other way, in the worst kind of way. Is there something almost...
It should have just ended on Secret History and just been like, okay, cool. Mistborn's over now. Kelsier's back. That's cool. The world exploded. I'm sorry.
Is there something almost meta about the idea of Sazed literally manipulating Wax to be in the plot to help get to the point where we can get into Era 3? Like, is Sanderson implanting himself to be like, I started this story and now I've realized that I need to manipulate these characters to be at the point they need to be at. Otherwise, this ain't going anywhere.
That's interesting.
So I agree.
Maxillium. We need Maxillium where he's going to be, you know? Fuck it.
But
I'm so sorry.
So I forgot about that.
I'm so sorry, PJ. You were
sorry.
No. That's effectively what happens to Vin too. It was just I feel much more clever and more subtle and more well done, but effectively you have these gods' influences on these characters from the jump, regardless.
That's a fair point. Rune and Preservation are not they're like influences. Again, this is why I don't like Secret History. Secret History does so much to explain the background of what's going on there to make it feel like it's the forefront of everything. And I don't think we needed that explanation. I think that, like, for the most part, you can get it through the little bit of dialogue that we get here and there. I do like actually having Laris and, like, talking to Preservation. That's neat. But, you know, to that point, it feels subtle versus sort of like, hey, I'm hitting you in the face with Harmony's got to get this in order. Kelsier is here, by the way. And Marsh survived when he probably shouldn't have. Yeah, I don't know. I think that for me, as I think about like Era 2 going into Era 3 again, Marasi is the character that I want to see come back. The only one should not be a POV, should be a governor, political leader, president, whatever. And that would be so great because I think that she, in the end, is still my favorite character. I think I landed differently before, but in the end, after bans, I was like, Marasi's the best. So I would love to see Marasi again, for sure.
I agree. I think Marasi is my favorite as well. Or actually, I've blanked her name. Wax's wife. Steris.
Steris is wonderful in The Lost Metal.
Yeah.
It gets short shrifted.
I think Steris may be my favorite character out of the series, actually. Yeah, I think that's the case. I feel like
regardless, the Harms sisters are the best. So.
Yeah. And then, but my only issue with Marasi is the idea that she doesn't join. And it's not an issue in world. I'm fine with it. But this is actually ironically something that is a bigger problem when we have the tangents outside of it. That I'm like, why did you get this payoff?
Why did you even bring it up?
Yeah. Like
why is this, again, this is the cut it out conversation where if I were the editor, I'd be like, no, what are you doing? She should be there with Wayne in those final moments before that. That would have been such a better, yeah, I've done this already, but yeah.
Yeah, I do feel that.
Glad you agree. Cool. So I know we had brought this up. One of the things that we had talked about was the villains and the way that they feel versus Era 1, Era 2. I'd love to get thoughts on what we think of all of the various villains. The Lord Ruler, Strap, Zane, Ruin, Bloody Tan, Leslie Palm, Telson, Trell, Autonomy, Harmony, Brandon Sanderson himself. What do we think of the various groupings of these, and like what do we make of each of them? I think as we evaluate the whole series, we'll do protagonists after this, but what do you think of the villains and how do you rate them? I guess is a thought. Some favorites, some that you didn't like, you know, who didn't work, Who worked?
I will go with who works. And I've always loved Straff. I think Straff is brilliant. He's got that Lord Tywin vibe. He has got just that foreboding presence that the moment he's on screen or even mentioned, like, nothing's good coming from there. Like, nothing's happening. I think his relationship with Elend is fantastic. I've always really loved Straff. I also really liked Palm from Shadows of Self. I think, wait, is that who it is? Is it right?
Yeah. Palm.
That is my favorite villain from Era 2. I think because it's a self-contained villain. It has tendrils that move on further, like in terms of the conversation around Kandra, but as a character, that is a character we can just explore and fully realized. And reevaluating the entire series, Palm is without my doubt like the favorite villain from Era 2.
I feel like Era 2's villains could have, like, my opinions of them could be so different based on just exposure. Like, I feel like Miles' 100 Lives. If we had
I totally forgot Miles on the list. You're right.
On Miles, that could be so fucking cool. Similarly, Bloody Tan. I don't know. We get him for the prologue of one book.
We get him a couple of times in flashbacks and otherwise. Like he's the
but it's the same. It's the same.
But yeah.
It's the same information that we get. It's not new. It's just like, hey, remember the prologue from the first book.
It also fuels the Leslie Palm bit, so like it makes her stand out as a villain, as a character more too. So
yeah, I think I agree. The rise and fall of Palm, of Bleeder, of Leslie, whatever you want to call her, feels the most complete and feels the most satisfying. But all of these pale in comparison to basically everything in Era 1. Like all the villains in Era 1 are just so good.
Yeah.
Edwarn, that's a good point. Edwarn has done really well, I feel like. Like the misdirection.
I don't know that he is though. In the end, because like
structurally he is. Structurally.
Yeah, okay, fine. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Brandon Sanderson himself, I think, is really funny as a villain.
You know, you want to talk about the main villain of Era 2, it's Brandon Sanderson.
But the big bad that I feel like is the most complex and the most interesting morally and philosophically is the Lord Ruler. Like, the more we learn about what's going on with the world, the more like little bit of sympathy that you get for him and like understanding what he was going for. And it just makes the moral question of like, should we have killed this guy, really fucking complicated. And I find that interesting.
That's definitely my go back to point as well. I think that I stand out. Like we just mentioned Edwarn. I firmly believe that like Leslie should have blown up in the cell and Edwarn should have lived in the Lost Metal and been the primary villain. That also would have felt more satisfying as a completed arc because we actually knew Edwarn as a character, as opposed to having to do all that heavy lifting in the Lost Metal to try to make Leslie the villain. So I feel like that would have been better and could have led to a much more interesting and dynamic character to end that series on. I think I'm with you. Era 2 for me, Bleeder's the best, and that also mirrors my feelings about which book I end up loving the most. Unfortunately, we already talked about this book. We'll talk about it later. But yeah, I land on Straff and the Lord Ruler. And I think that some of that is actually some of the work that's done in Secret History to explore the Lord Ruler when he dies and comes back and talks with Kelsier. I love that moment. It's one of my favorite moments of Secret History when it's like, you don't even fucking know, dude. And it just makes Kelsier feel so properly small, like he should, that it is frustrating that the Lord Ruler doesn't continue as a character instead of Kelsier. I would be so much more convinced by the entire story of Mistborn if the Lord Ruler would have survived in the background than Kelsier, because the Lord Ruler is propagating good or was trying to propagate good, and like neutrality maybe is better because he did do a lot of bad stuff. But God, I don't know. Yeah, Lord Ruler and Straff, the top two. I think Straff I prefer for like the character moment of like villainy that happens there. But yeah, on the whole,
I think this is. I'm going to try to not go. Oh wait, sorry. Just need to plug him out. What I will say is that Kelsier, the reason I'm on board with Kelsier being back is because I don't think he's being brought back as a protagonist. I think he is being brought back as I think the furthest Sanderson may go as anti-hero, but I think for a lot of people reading into it, I don't think he's coming back as a protagonist in the sense of everything. I think in Mistborn, he'll be a grey character in terms of how he's operating. But I think I don't believe in him being a protagonist. So I think for the people that, the same way that Sanderson's kind of come out and been like, yeah, people that love Kelsey, you gotta remember, like, he's a bit, is kind of like, that's
it's a bit
him.
dodgy.
Yeah, it's a bit like him saying, be prepared. Like, you may want to rethink how you feel about Kelsey for what I'm going to do with him. That I get that kind of vibe. I feel like he's going to have a very different role than a lot of people are anticipating.
Right. So maybe my ire is better placed at the fandom, is what you're suggesting.
Yes, I would imagine.
Propping him up
like
as this good
all
character.
hatred, direct it at the people.
Right. It's the people's fault
yeah.
that I don't appreciate Kelsey.
Who else was a great villain? I mean, Ruin works perfectly to what he needs to do in the first series, whereas Sazed, I think, oversteps the line in terms of how involved he is, because, like you said, they are doing similar things to manipulating characters. But Ruin is, we don't see it. It's whispers and we get reveals that he's been influencing things, but it's different to, like, it's just a bit too, like, tapping you on the nose. It feels like the same way you were saying about being talked down to. Like, sometimes I feel like it is watching one of his lectures on YouTube and he's explaining everything. And I'm like, can you just give me a little credit as a reader? That is,
we're both literature snobs, so that kind of makes a little bit of sense for us collectively to be like, you can, I understand that you're direct, but, like, you can give a little bit of, like, flourish. And that's also my whole bit with his prose, but, yeah.
I am not a literature snob.
Yeah, we know.
In contrast,
I don't genuinely mean snob, of course. We both appreciate literature and read very widely. And so, I don't know. It's a different battle, different gamut. Yeah, I think in particular, the reason that I throw Harmony into the list is because of it's this sort of unsubtle touch, but it does trend towards, villainy might be too far of a stretch, but like anti-hero sort of, because of the way that he's manipulating people and characters and the way that kind of presses. How do we feel about autonomy and Trell in the end versus, per se, Ruin?
Bad.
Yeah.
I felt like the whole, what you were mentioning with the army of red and gold soldiers, whatever, I was reading it, I was like, this feels like Steppenwolf rocking up with the flying monsters in fucking Justice League. And comparing anything to Justice League written by Joss Whedon is not a good thing. Like, that is not what I want to be reminded of. It felt like that. It felt like just an empty threat. Like, it felt like being threatened by, like getting it's like when you're a kid and someone's like, or if you're not, I'll bring Santa Claus if you keep on acting like this. And I'm like, well, fucking get Santa Claus. Ring him up. Get him on for it.
Get him on the phone.
That's what I felt like with Trell. Like, it's constantly this thing. It's like, well, Trell, you don't want him rocking up. And then, like, they don't. I'm like, who cares? Like, I don't know. It felt like this series felt a lot like Blue Balls to me. Felt a lot like dangling something in front of my face and then going, you're going to have to wait for the next era to come out, sir. And I'm like, that's my main. Trell didn't work for me.
Mm-hmm. I think completely agree. It was a large villain that conveniently made all the small villains make cohesive sense together, but just didn't have any sort of resolution.
And even the book explains it as like, Trell is weird and autonomy is weird in the way that it functions. And I thought that explanation is interesting, but not compelling. And that's like a big difference of like, I'm interested in learning more, but I don't know if it's actually something that I would like turn pages for, versus like, I could read a Wikipedia page about this and like be like, oh, okay, shake my head. Yeah, I love that. But I don't want to spend like 100 pages exploring to get to that point of knowledge. It doesn't, again, compel me to turn the pages.
Do you know what? The more I think about it, the more that the Justice League comparison is absolutely.
I'm fucking loving it
because it is. It's Steppenwolf. Telsin is the Steppenwolf to trail like Autonomy's dark side. The villain that is there, literally in the hole, like hello, and then they close it. Like it quite literally is the same. And the more I think about that, oh dear.
It's
and
brutal.
In that film, sorry, spoiler alerts for Joss Whedon's Justice League, but I felt like maybe that's how you feel about Secret History, is that the scene where the Flash and Cyborg are digging up Superman's body. That's basically all of them digging up all of the characters from Era 1 and be like, they need to be in this. And oh dear.
Mm-hmm.
And none of the humor works. Oh my God.
I genuinely am loving this. I think you nailed it.
I've got an hour and a half video essay to film now.
On how Era 2 compares to The Lost Metal.
I mean, all we're missing, and I hope we don't get it, is a parallel between Brandon Sanderson and Joss Whedon.
Oy vey, that would
couldn't happen, guys. I mean,
pretty wholesome.
There's this other. Go ahead, PJ. Sorry,
I said he's pretty wholesome. I don't know if that'll happen.
By comparison, yeah. There's this other part of me that came to this realization, and this is maybe just a side tangent with Kelsier. A lot of people have brought up the parallels, of course, to. Given that Mistborn is kind of his stand-in for Earth in a way, Kelsier is at the same time appears to be at this point in the plot a stand-in for Jesus, like coming back and whatnot inside of the Christian faith. But I came to realize as I was reading The Lost Metal and like thinking about Secret History and ingesting it, it's not that it parallels modern Christianity necessarily or the thoughts on the return, but it more closely mirrors the return of Jesus in the Mormon faith, which is to say that he basically cross-dimensionally sails across the ocean, lands on a new plane, founds a religion, drives a path, leaves these golden tablets. Golden tablets are also left by Moroni and blah, blah, blah. If you've read a lot about the Mormon faith, it makes so much sense that he is actually the Mormon equivalent of Jesus than he is the Christian equivalent. And it drives me wild now that I've drawn that comparison.
Well, there are a lot of, like, even the only things that can be read from metal can be trusted, etc. There's a lot in Era 1 as well that's very clear. And I think it does a great job at alluding to, but not being on the nose in Era 1.
Yeah.
Like, that's what I really appreciate about Era 1 is that you can tell where he's drawn it from, but he does it in such a compelling way that feels completely justified in world, that I hope that he can do that with it as he moves forward.
He's done it with a number of other books. So it's like, he, again, does as you mentioned earlier, does a wonderful job of exploring theology throughout the fiction. And that's, honestly fairly unique. And that's one of the reasons that I do still enjoy these stories, despite all of the gripes and otherwise, is it's one of the few authors that's willing to open up that can of worms and, give it a try.
Sazed's whole plot line.
Yeah.
Is just amazing. I love that. I love the theological touch to it.
Hero of Ages
is one of the few authors in fantasy. Go ahead.
I was going to say, Hero of Ages is my favorite out of the original trilogy, which I don't think puts me in good standing with the group I'm a part of. That is my personal opinion. I think Hero of Ages is my favorite for Sazed.
I would love to take this and transition into our series ranking if we're down for where we stand on things. The only thing I'd say, Ben, is add in Secret History if you hadn't considered that as a part of your ranking. But who wants to start? Who's ready to go?
I've got it.
Yeah.
So I'm going top to bottom.
Yep.
Well of Ascension, Final Empire, Shadows of Self, Hero of Ages, Lost Metal, Secret History, Alloy of Law, Bands of Mourning.
Bold questions, Ben? Anything you want to interrogate?
So Bands of Mourning being bottom is very interesting. I can see why. I feel like Bands of Mourning was better in my head before Lost Metal. And then Lost Metal has lowered both of those in my head, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I would I don't know whether you want me to go into mine to kind of give
fire away.
a parallel.
Maybe the best way to do this is for us to all like power rank and then talk about it and why we put what where.
Because I would go Hero of Ages, Well of Ascension, Final Empire. Or actually, I'd go Hero of Ages, Final Empire, Well of Ascension. I would go Shadows of Self, Secret History, Bands of Mourning, Alloy of...
Lost Metal? Was that in there?
Oh, Lost Metal. I forgot about it.
Yeah. I forgot about it.
I'd put Lost Metal on the same level as Bands of Mourning.
Okay, cool. I've got Well of Ascension, The Final Empire, Shadows of Self, Secret History, chapters 1 through 5, The Hero of Ages, Lost Metal, Bands of Mourning, Alloy of Law, Secret History, chapter 6 or part 6. Yeah. So it's interesting. Each of us like really capture the original trilogy in the top of this, but we do rank Shadows shockingly highly in hindsight, which is funny because that's the one, of course, that we talked about together too. And like, I knew that I liked it the best out of the 3 that we'd read. And originally I had thought that Lost Metal was better, but in a reread, I was like, nah, as I processed it. So it's interesting. Why Shadows where it is? And then maybe we can talk about our Era 1.
I would go Shadows where it is because I think it's the most encapsulated strong story in the sense we get introduced to, we have progression from where we started for our main characters. From just a plot and the villain perspective, we're introduced to a villain. They have a progression throughout that story that is culminated, and then we move forward. Like it's a book. It's a book that actually functions as a self-contained story, whereas Alloy of Law feels like a prologue that should have been a book, and then a book that didn't need to be a book. And Bands of Mourning feels like it's the first part to. It feels like the same way that you've got like Infinity War Part 1 and Part 2 or whatever. Like, and it struggles because it's a great first part, but then Lost Metal drops the ball, so then they both fall as a result. And Shadows of Self stands alone as the only one that isn't like beaten up by other books in the series or other bits in it, that it's kind of just the one left standing for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Until this conversation, I hadn't considered why I dislike Bands of Mourning of all of them. Like, and don't get me wrong.
Still a good book.
I still enjoy all of these books and I still think they're good, but the Lost Metal retroactively makes Bands of Mourning unnecessary in a lot of ways and just doesn't follow up. So it just feels like a kind of misplaced
footnote.
Yeah. So thank you for helping me find those feelings about it. I appreciate that. And I think I agree. I do rank Bands a little bit higher than Alloy just for the sake of, I think Bands is a better told story, to your point, Ben, about like the idea of like the prologue should have been the full story, and then, you know, the other bit didn't need to exist, or could have been the beginning of Shadows of Self to really set up this depressing story that is Shadows in a way. And Shadows feels like the most encompassing of Era 2. And I love it for those reasons. We do see character growth in Bands, and it feels like it should be a conclusion, but it isn't. And so we have the Lost Metal, of which gets ranked higher because it is a conclusion and it feels like a culmination, even if some of those things are misplaced. I'm more interested now that we've talked a lot about Era 2. I'm more interested in the ranking that we have with Hero of Ages versus Well of Ascension versus the Final Empire, and sort of our preferences there. PJ and I both love the Well of Ascension. That's a controversial take, I think, among fans in the fandom, but love to hear your takes on the book and why Heroes at the top.
So I first read it, I was a Well of Ascension. That was my top. And Heroes of Ages was my least favorite. So I've actually done a straight flip on a reread because I think Hero of Ages does, it's all down to Sazed. I think that the exploration, the payoff to his character, the journey he goes on is extremely, I think it's extremely brave for an author to take, because putting Sazed at such an unbelievably low point at this point in the series for such a long length of that book is it could have gone extremely poorly. And instead it creates the most, like the biggest payoff in that series to me, that I remember reading it for the first time and loving it, but reading it on the second time, It was just on an actual strength of like sticking to what you planned and sticking to knowing that your vision is going to pay off. And like, for that, it stands out to me. Well of Ascension is fantastic. And I think there's a lot of amazing things in it. It's just, I think it's one of those things where I love Final Empire I think it's the same way that I love Final Empire, the same way that I love the Fellowship of the Ring film, that as a cohesive, just standalone thing, I think it's a brilliant setup to an entire series.
Totally in with you on that.
Yeah. And I think that's what levels it up. And then I think it just comes down to personal taste of, I think I prefer Sayz's low point, and I'm more invested in the theology, which I always have been with Sanderson, compared to the moral questioning of Vin in the second. And I think that just comes down to like what you're personally looking for. That I think that's why Heroes works for me more than well.
PJ, why your ranking of the books?
Now you made a really good argument for...
You did make a really good argument. I know why Heroes lower on my list.
I feel like we get so many complicated like character progression, like just it's just so full in Well of Ascension. I am now struggling to remember exactly what happens in each of the books. I just like I know what happens in the series. No, but despite the fact that you and I spent, I think because of the fact that you and I spent so much time, like hours, talking about that fucking dress.
Oh my God, yeah.
I loved it. I loved that conversation. I loved the discussion. I loved the argument of it and the symbolism that's inherent in it, even if we disagree with what it symbolizes.
Ben, do you remember the dress scene that happens with Vin in Well of Ascension? She goes to a tailor of whom specializes in Mistborn wear. And so she's granted, or she's like given, she's taken out by Alriandre to like go get fitted for this dress and Tynwil and whatnot. And so they're going shopping, and there's this sort of beauty that she feels immediately in the dress. And then she's told that it also has space for all the Mistborn things. And she later carves up the dress. And there's a lot around the dress. We've had many conversations around the dress, but there's this question of like, especially with just Vin as a character, one of her biggest internal conflicts is merging those two selves. So this girl that she wants to be, who goes to these balls and does all these things, and then the other side, which is the Mistborn side. And there's a question of what the dress represents in the middle, which is something that PJ and I have hotly debated for many an hour on the show. Literally 10 hours that we've cut down to like maybe 3 collectively over many episodes. But yeah, the argument, just so you're caught up.
Yeah. So you're aware of my stance on it. My stance is that this dress is what finally bridged the gap for her to accept that she can be both. She can be both a beautiful lady of a noble house and the knife, like, and the Mistborn.
And my problem is that maybe she can visualize herself now that she has the dress, but she does not actualize that until much later. And so this isn't a bridge point. This is still a separation point. It is a potential that she sees, but it is not the actualization. It's not until they get married that she finally realizes that she can be both.
Yeah,
which I think is shittier than what PJ suggests, for the record. I think that's a worse ending, but I think it is what we're kind of given.
I always viewed the dress as a bridge, and like a necessary bridge, in the sense of like, I think you're both right, honestly, which isn't exactly fun to debate.
I'm just kidding.
But yeah, because I do love the idea of you two arguing over a dress. It's like very fun about that. But,
so many hours.
But I feel like the dress I've agree with PJ in the sense that it represents that idea of that the journey to finding a middle and acceptance. That I don't think it's necessarily the end point, but it's a big step towards it for her.
Okay, cool. I agree with you. I do think it's a stepping point, for the record. I just don't think that she's fully embraced it at that point. She sees it as utility. She sees this as potential because she is still in that moment thinking about all of her Mistborn-ness more than she is about the beauty of herself being in that dress. And both Tynwil and Alriandre are trying to reset her. Alriandre for ulterior motives of like, the only way you should be, married to Elend really and be the queen is for this reason, or the empress. But
I'm going to go ahead and change a previous answer. Alriandre is the biggest villain of the story.
PJ despises OverlyAverageBen. All right. So we've got a patron question here, and I asked for a couple just to kind of talk about over the course of the show. But I really like this as a lead into what we're going to do to kind of round this out. But if you could have a drink with any one character at a bar at a nondescript location, potentially off of or on Scadrial, who would it be and why?
If you need some time to think about that, I've got my answer.
Yeah,
loaded.
go ahead.
Fire away.
Ham. 100% ham. Ham would be so much fun to like get loosened up and just chat about whatever's on his mind.
Oh my God, you're so right.
Yeah, that is the
This is
correct
why we're
answer.
friends, PJ, for the record. Like, because I am ham. In my own right.
That is the correct answer.
Just kidding, not really.
You can have the same answer. I'm fine with it. I won't be jealous.
Mine definitely isn't ham, but I do like that response. I'm going to throw it out there. I want one from each era. I'm going to tag in a little bonus here, just since we're talking about both eras. So I like the ham answer. I think I would want to talk to Marsh Era 2. I would love to sit down as my Era 2 pick. I would pick Marsh Era 2 to just kind of talk about, like, comparatively, he's still mortal, even though he's lived a very long time, as we kind of learn over the course of the series. I'd love to feel like he's leading into the conclusion of his life, and then he's brought out of it at the end of this. But I would love to feel and to like talk to him about how tangible that feels near the end, all the knowledge he's gained, how he's maybe softened to his brother over centuries of kind of learning those kind of things. I don't know. I just think that Marsh would be even ushering people in through the gates of like the end of their lives as well. I think that Marsh is the most fascinating perspective in Era 2 that I wish that we explored. And I hope we get him in Era 3.
Damn, they're both good answers. I think for Era 1 I would go ham, but as a second choice, I'm going to go for the British answer. I'm going to say clubs, because my man's grumpy. He just wants to sit there and suddenly drink. I'll allow him to do it. And so once he's had a couple, he'll get started telling stories. We're making fun of the people he works with and everything. You know, I feel like once you get him going, if you get on his good side, you get some good stories out of clubs. Just for, he feels like a very grumpy British man. And then Era 2, if I could take the singular little part of Azid that's still inside of the god form he now has, if I could just take him out, give him a drink, go like, are you okay, buddy? Like, you seem to be struggling a bit. And then I try to help him, because I feel like my man would have one drink and break down crying and be like, I've done some bad things. And I'd be, shit. I feel like he could use that. And then patch him back up, stick him back in. And then if we just do that every year, we could make sure he's all right.
That's a very Neil Gaiman answer of you to like pull out of God. Why can't I remember the comic book? Sandman. It's a very Sandman answer where it's like you're meeting back up with that friend, however many centuries later, and pulling them out of reality, right? With the ship captain, if I remember correctly, or the shipmate. I think that's the story. I can't recall. I'll get flogged in the comments, but it's fine. PJ, do you have an Era 2 answer?
My Era 2 answer was similarly going to be Sazed.
It's good.
It'd be cool to get a retrospective on his time as a mortal and his experiences as a god. But barring that, I think I think Wax could be pretty cool, just to be able to get into some of those rough stories that we don't really get much of, or the journalist running the broadsheet that they meet up with, and I can't remember.
Oh, the paranoid woman. Wild. That's who you want to talk to.
I think it'd be just an unhinged conversation. I think it'd be a lot of fun.
Okay, all right. I can dig that.
But I think I'm having a much more difficult time picking one from Era 1 or from Era 2, because while the characters seem to be like, the prose is better, the characters themselves don't feel as deep as a lot of the characters in Era 1 for some reason.
Yeah, I would lean towards, if I had to pick someone that wasn't Marsh, which again is like Era 1 intrigue into post Era 2, so we're talking like timeline stuff. I feel like I'd want to sit down with Marasi or someone like that, but at the same time, it's like, what do you really know that you could like enlighten me on? Like, what's your pull? I feel like it would just be two friends having a drink at a bar, which isn't a problem. It's just like, I think that each of those would kind of have a more friendly connotation as you pick anyone in Era 2 for the most part as the lead POV protagonists.
I'm changing my answer to Renette.
Yeah, you would get a drink with Renette.
Oh, yeah,
tracks.
that's true.
Yeah.
Tracks. My Era 1 pick, I think, is... There are two picks here, right? There's I want to get a drink with Kelsier because we wouldn't get a drink. I would smash a bottle across his face. The other Era 1 pick is I would probably choose the Lord Ruler, Sans Power, to have kind of a similar conversation that I would try to have with Marsh. To really kind of, I think my conversation would be very confrontational about like, okay, so I know that you only had a limited amount of time with these things, but like, you couldn't think of anything better, like enslavement and like all you did, like you couldn't be like, well, but dude, and I'd be like, but dude, like, come on, try to like slap him out of it a little bit. Yeah.
Can we all agree that the worst person to get a drink with from Era 1 would be Zane? That would be a misery of a drink.
Yeah, no, it'd be like drinking with myself. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hot
I don't know
topic
if I want to
Molgoth,
introduce
you know?
alcohol into that into that can of
Into
worms.
that whole thing. Yeah, that's a fair point. Yeah, if we're talking about like getting a drink with villains, Brandon Sanderson would be hysterical. I think actually it would be very funny and a fun time. So I wanted to end this on sort of a rapid fire-esque thing. We can break these down and talk about them as we go. But some awards for bests between eras and whatnot. I've got another one. I've got another patron question that I'm going to append to all of this. But I figure some awards for bests. We talked about our favorite books. So we're going to talk about everything but our favorite books in the awards here. But I would love to hear everyone's favorite character from the eras. Where do we land? Who stands out?
I know mine. I'm Era 1 Sazed, Era 2 Steris. They're firm favourites for me. I've already explained Sazed, and Steris is an oasis in a desert. She has a unique character, a very relatable sense of self. It's a great exploration, imposter syndrome and anxiety and everything. For being someone that has awful, catastrophic anxiety, watching her plan every possible thing that could happen was complete. I felt like for the first time since reading Misery, I felt like I was reading a character that I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, okay, I know what that feels like. Like, that is how my brain functions. So I appreciate that. So they're my firm favorites from both.
Yeah. I love those picks. I love the comparison that you draw to Misery because it is that, and it is, if you haven't read it, I don't know if you have or not, but Gerald's Game as well sort of mirrors the anxiety from that perspective that I really appreciate. Those are sort of more, how would you say it? The whole plot is focused around a Steris-esque situation. So, that's its own thing. But yeah, I totally agree with you. I love those picks. PJ, where do you land on favorite characters?
I think I'm going to agree with Sazed from Era 1. I felt like his story was so complicated and well described. And Era 2, I think especially after Lost Metal, I think I have to go with Wayne. I know, Ben, you mentioned that he's your least favorite character, but I felt like Lost Metal, and we've had several discussions about whether or not it's an upgrade in writing or editing. But
yeah, Gillian Redfern, of whom edited all of The First Law and many other books, edited The Lost Metal, and it does feel like it's a better composed book than all of Era 2. But
and his humor and the way his story wraps up, like really, really ratchets up in that last book. And I feel like he has the most emotional and compelling life story of all the characters in Era 2.
I so agree. I have it's tough to come away with a different take than Sazed being the best, right? If you asked me after I had only read Era 1, my favorite characters I was very torn between loving Spook and loving Sazed. And Secret History put a spike through Spook for me in a way that I have not been able to recuperate that. So I think I'm with you on Sazed being my favorite. If I had to try to pick someone different, I would back into our good boy Elend, of whom, resolved mostly in Well of Ascension. He's kind of just a Superman in Hero of Ages, which is another reason that I love Well of Ascension, because it's a completion of their character arcs in its own right. But yeah, I totally adore Sazed, and my backup answer there is Elend, our good boy, our moral paladin, as we refer to him many a time. So Yeah, but yeah, Spook was for such a long time one of my favorite characters in the series, and then Secret History Done took some agency away from our boy and gave it over to Kelsier explaining things to him. So as it goes, it's fine. So favorite character, I already ruined my own pick here, but our best good boy, our best paladin, our favorite of the good characters, and I mean this in the way that like it's very easy for us to get tied up in Sazed being the best character, but who among the supporting cast was your favorite? I figured we were all going to kind of land in the same camp, so I had to ask or beg the question because I knew that our fans were going to be a little bit upset if we didn't talk about some of our supporting cast.
I think Straff
is the goodest boy, like just the sweetest.
I mean, the way you phrased it, it's hard to not pick Elend. With the sort of paladin,
but he's not supporting. Like he's
okay.
A supporting character.
Fair enough.
I know that I did literally like feed into that immediately with Elend, but yeah,
Alendi, maybe.
You liked Alendi more than you liked Ham, for instance.
I don't know. Alendi is intriguing to me, and maybe it's because we don't get anything other than like the logbooks from him, but he's seemingly has a good head on his shoulders and is truly
only committed one genocide. Yeah, if you read between the lines, kind of. He was a general. He led wars, and he's very Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah,
I don't know.
It wasn't quite a genocide, but it was like he burned. He was specifically targeting some people. There was a reason that Rashik didn't like him.
Good point. Can 10 soon count?
Of course, he's the best goodest.
Well, I don't know. I don't know what counts as supporting because
support
like
okay. Our main characters: Vin, Elend, Sazed. I mean, Wax, Wayne, Maraseed, Steris.
Then I'll go with 10 soon, specifically from Era 1.
Era 1 wise, I'd go Breeze. I really liked Breeze. He was just a fun character to be around whenever someone was talking to him. Like, good old Breeze. He felt, maybe it's just because I'm reading A Song of Ice and Fire at the moment, but he feels very Tyrion to me in a way, like kind of smarmy, but charming. And you're never quite sure whether there's that I'm being influenced or not. It's a great character to explore. And I think Breeze and Ham as a pair work together perfectly. And then Era 2 wise, I'd go with Runette's partner that's introduced.
Yeah,
she's
great.
She's a fun character. Just spice it up.
That's a good pick on Era 2. I think I'm with you. It's hard to think of supporting Era 2 characters because it is a wide POV cast, right? And so there's a lot of issues to pick from there. I think I land on Reddy in the end being my favorite of the Era 2 supporting characters. I think that he's very interesting, especially as he approaches Maraseed. He is one of the few characters that I fully believe his evolution throughout the entire series and the way that he changes and adapts and evolves into a situation. So I really appreciate him. I think I'm with you on Breeze. I don't think it's harder than that. Like there is a, do people actually like me, or is it just my charm? Is it just my superpower that like makes them charm to me, that makes them like me, that I really appreciate about his character and the limited POV that we get from him. So I think I'm entirely in that camp. I do love Good Boy Tensine though. It's tough. That was a tough choice.
For Era 2, I might go with Runette for it, despite her sort of surly-natured attitude, especially towards Wayne. She's a huge boon to the overall story and is just fun for me to read.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
She's the big sciencey dork, of course. Yeah. Naturally, of course.
And a lurcher.
You went that way, right? Speaking of PJ, the next question here is from a patron. Do you stand by your choices for your preferred elementic ability?
Absolutely.
So PJ is still a lurcher, so he's still pulling himself around his workshop. Ben, what's you may not remember from the question. If you had to have an elementic ability, what would it be?
Oh, which one I chose?
I can definitely check the notes.
Oh, I remember.
You may not have,
I chose tin, right?
You did, I think.
Yes. I stand by that one as well, because that was one that no one would know that I had it. I didn't have to necessarily reveal it. So I could still exist as a person and just be... My eyesight's going as well, honestly. I've been looking at signs and thinking I need to get them checked. So if I could just dial it up a little, it would really help me.
It'd be really great. You don't need to worry about squinting anymore. I totally get it. I think I do as well. I think that I stand by my push versus PJ's pull. I think that one of the things that like I knew going into reading this is when PJ and I talked about this for the first time, I had already read Era 2 mostly. And so like I had seen what Wax could do, and it's basically the same if you're cautious enough and you measure those bits enough to like make it work. So yeah. Mm-hmm. That was my perspective on it.
So we're all keeping our answers.
We all lock in. You know, it's a our favorite villain. And this is not era agnostic. This is just overall favorite villain. I think we talked about these. So I think I'll lock in Straff.
I'm gonna continue my sort of Lord Ruler just because of the complication of it, just because of the sort of moral questioning that comes about in the next couple books.
Yeah, I think it's really hard. That they are the two. If I was going to lean to one, I'd lean to the Lord Ruler purely through, like you say, the implications that are brought around later on is a perfect way of demonstrating like an organic, taking a villain that could easily be two-dimensional and then adding that third dimension to create a really nuanced character after the fact, I think is genius.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree with that take. I just think that Straff, like, that bakes in some grayness for the Lord Ruler over the time as you continue throughout the story and recontextualizes it in a really nice way. While I totally agree, I love the way that Straff is just vile in a way that so few characters are in Sanderson's work. He is just repulsive and in like a not just black way. Like he's got nuance inside of there, and it's good. Tywin, I think you brought up that comparison a couple of times, and yeah, fits and sits.
I would also just say the first Inquisitors beat Vinna. That scene is so incredibly scary, like genuinely frightening to be like at the whim of it, and I would put that up there as well because they're not named or anything, but just the presence they have is
one
crazy.
Of them is Ka, I think.
Ka.
Yeah, one of them.
We get the brief point of view from Ka.
Yeah, that's at the end of the Final Empire, right before someone kills him. Marsh? Vin? I forget. Someone kills him. That's a fun little POV shift that happens right at the end of Mistborn. So, best villain. I do want to hit some least favorites before we end on a favorite here. So, least favorite plot moment, the thing that grated on you the most.
Most of the existence of the Ghostbloods, not because it was like bad plot, it's because it just it's not necessary, it doesn't really go anywhere, and like ultimately felt like it just took up some of Maricy's time, and I can imagine recontextualizing that, or that will get recontextualized in Era 3, but for right now, it just doesn't feel important. It feels like a vehicle for Kelsier to continue to exist in the world.
I agree.
Ben and I are both like keeping a lot of quiet words here, but we do agree, I think, in terms of that like bit.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. My choice would be the prologue of Alloy of Law. I think that it sets up a precedence of wasted potential that is the through line throughout the entire series. Is just somewhat like him having an idea for that original Alloy of Law that didn't quite work the way that it could have, and then having to write to explain why that's important to make the present matter. And it's just this, it all stems from, if that was handled better, I would have been invested in the characters more. And I think that's that's an incipient moment of just a problem that I have throughout the entire series.
Throughout all of Era 2. Yeah.
Yes,
I mean, like being
Era
the
2.
worst moment of the whole. Yeah. It shouldn't come as a shock for anyone that my least favorite moment is the entirety of part 6 of Secret History. But I think in particular, that moment that grades on me the most is that moment with Marsh, in which it feels like it sacrifices a literal choice of him to like die at the behest of like, the only reason that you could make that choice to kill yourself, little buddy, is because I was there, Big Brother Kelsier, to intercede to make sure that Ruin wasn't paying enough attention, when the entire book of the Hero of Ages is built up to that moment through Marsh's perspective. And it just undermines one of my favorite rebellious plot beats in the most grandiose way. And that's part of the reason that Hero of Ages gets buried on my list, is because of the way that Secret History recontextualizes that and Spook's arc. So it was my favorite book until I read Secret History in this series. And then Secret History, just those bits did a number on it. So yeah, that's the grading one for me. I totally get, though, that prologue. That's a far more nuanced point about the entire trajectory of the series. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not so much I think the chapter itself works well as a self-contained thing. It's just like we were doing with the idea of restructuring it. If that happened at the end of the first book, then at the end of the second book, you have the twist of, oh, it was actually, what's it called? If we just were more invested, it would have had a much better reaction from me. I would have emotionally been invested.
A lot of people are like averse. I should say a lot of people are like, oh man, that didn't work for me. And they'll like reflect on these things. And I think that one of the biggest things is like, why didn't it work? And like asking yourself why it doesn't function. And I feel like Stephen King's rule of like flashbacks are cheap is a thing that like I think everyone should keep in their head, because often it shortcuts storytelling of like leading up to that moment. It's better to paint like a real life and then see what makes you fall out from that real life than it is to just be like, oh, I was broken in that moment. It adds so much more context, and it gives us the meat of the reason that we should care. I believe flashbacks should be avoided as often as possible in most fiction. And I think this is a prime example of one that I was just like, I can get it because it's a prologue, but I don't know. I would have cared more, to your point, if it would have been the meat of the story. So, yeah. All right. One more unsavory one here. Least favorite character.
I have it.
I know you have it.
I really just don't like Alriandra. I didn't trust her for the longest time. I assumed that she would turn at some point, and then there's no character progression, and suddenly we're supposed to just trust her. And I don't get it. Yeah.
It's because she's not a liar, PJ. Because she proves that she's not a liar with her dad. That's it.
She's set up to be this, like...
Yeah.
There's all this sneaky shit going on with her, and it just never gets resolved, and we're supposed to just forget about it. Like, she's sneaking around, she's spying on them while they're talking as a like small council, and that never gets addressed again. I don't know.
You're not wrong.
Yeah.
And I understand why you don't like her. Ben, it's yours. You ready? It's your least favorite. Gotta have one.
Oh yeah, there we go. Sorry, the internet went a little there.
Yeah.
I would say both from Era 2, my least favorite characters are Sazed. Sazed is I just felt like we never had enough time with him. He felt like a contrivance. And the issue with, like, every time Wax, it all comes down to that issue, is every time Wax was like, I don't want to put the earring in. I'm like, I get that. I really do, buddy, but I'm not invested in the reason you don't want to. I understand why, but I don't care why. And so then I was just like, it was just so frustrating every time. I was like, give us a little bit more. I don't need Sazed to be good. I am quite happy with him making morally messed up decisions. I felt like the relationship between him and the Kandra was dropped, which was fascinating. And I felt like his relationship with Wax was shortcutted to a short-term resolution. And then we now have to get all the answers for everything else in Era 3. And it's kind of like, what was... You just teased it with us. And then the other is Kelsier for a complete lack of existence. He felt like just a I don't know, like a Star Wars villain, in the sense of like, he felt like Snow, where he's there and you're meant to be like, oh my God, it's him. But when you actually listen to him, you're like, you gonna get involved? You got your slippers on, mate. Like, are you actually gonna get involved in the plot? Or like, what are you doing? He's like, trust me, I'm really trying. Can you not see? I'm really trying to get there. I'm sure there'll be a spin-off story to explain what I was doing during this time. Trust me, it was really important. Like a Captain Marvel where she's like, oh, bro, there's earthquakes going on. I've got to be out this plot because otherwise I'd be really involved. But there are earthquakes going on and I can't be involved, and they just fly off. Like Kelsey just had such a lack of presence that I just thought, why even bother? And yeah, so that's my two weakest.
You know, it should come as no shock that I agree with you on the Kelsier front. I feel like the caricature of Kelsier does a lot to disservice the mentor picture of Kelsier that we get from the first book. And it truly, like, completely garbles it in my head. I originally finished reading that novella in the middle of us talking about Mistborn 1, and I just stopped giving a shit about Kelsier's character in that moment. And it's very audibly, like, you can hear it as we're going through the podcast of like, cool, Kelsier is doing X, I don't care. And it's so tough because I love your position on this being similar to a Star Wars villain, because it is a caricature of what villainy should be in a lot of cases, and we don't necessarily see that all the time, which is why Rogue One rules. But you know, it's just something tangible that you want to latch onto of like, why are you here? And what exactly is this outside of setup, outside of a Marvel after credits scene that you're trying to build up to like pay us off to lead into the next era? And yeah, so if I have to avoid Kelsier, of whom should be obvious at this point for myself, I think my least favorite character falls to the depiction of Zane. I love what Zane is in the story, and I've been very adamant about, like, I like Zane quite a bit. But I think that Zane is, in and of himself, a caricature of what Brandon was trying to write, which was a nuanced, sort of demented character, and instead he ends up being, we've made fun of it many times, even in this podcast, like a goth mall emo boy. And, like, it's okay to be, like, that sort of character, but it is the worst example of a manifestation of depression and DID I think that he's even attempting for at this point. And I guarantee at this point he would rewrite Zane to be a very different character. But I think Zane is simultaneously a character that I really like for what he's supposed to do in the story, but I cannot stand. Can and cannot. It's tough. Yeah. The final question is from one of our patrons. Ziba, thank you so much for asking this. Your favorite relationship, and this is not meant to span just all relationships, friendships, etc. Like, what's your favorite relationship from the eras?
Sazed and Tindwyl is great, but I think, man, Lost Metal really changes things for Era 2. It really, really shifts things up. And
in which way? Like,
it makes a lot of the relationships stronger. Like Wax and Steris, I felt like for most of the series, up until the Lost Metal, wasn't that deep of a relationship. Like we didn't get the emotional depths of it until the Lost Metal. So I have a hard time. Like same with Wayne and Renette.
Mm.
Even though it's like a tenuous at best friendship, it's still a much more satisfyingly complex relationship after Lost Metal than it was for the first 3 books in the series.
Lost Metal wins for character work, no doubt. Like that's Lost Metal excels because of what it does with the characters.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to go with Sazed and Tindwyl for that reason.
Okay.
I'm gonna take both eras. I'm gonna do one for each.
That's fair.
I'm gonna go Vin and Zaze for era 1. I love their kind of their relationship from mentor, like teaching her how to get along, to equals, to what eventually happens. I think that they have a sustained respect, and I really enjoy their relationship. And then in era 2, I'm going to go for Steris and Marassi. That I think that one is one that slowly and quietly evolves from alluding to the sense that they weren't close, they didn't quite get along, to then a mutual understanding of what each other are good at and a respect for each other. I think is one of the subtle things about the series that isn't harped on about. It's just this quiet evolution, their relationship.
I love both of those choices. I particularly agree with you on one of the takeaways that I had when I was like evaluating my thoughts post Lost Metal is I love the depiction of siblings in this sense. I'm the oldest of 5. I've got a number of siblings. I have different relationships with each of them. And it is something that is not well depicted in media and that I really appreciated about that relationship. Well, not my choice. I love that pick. I have a tough time, like, not just latching into that and choosing it, but, yeah, great choice. And then also, of course, that mentor relationship with Stacey and Vin is so strong and so incredible that, you completely forget about Kelsier comparatively. Yeah. I think I go with Clubs and Breeze for my Era 1 pick. And I know PJ will let you hop in and pick your Era 1 pick too, for sure. But Clubs and Breeze for me is just like this. You mentioned it earlier, but part of the reason that Clubs is such a great character is because he is this guy that you want to take out to the bar and you want to get drunk to like make him expose himself and like to make this like whole thing. And it just feels like there's so much more there. And that's what I love about their relationship is despite the fact that like Brandon isn't having them drink a whole lot in scenes together to get to that point, it does feel like those two fit together perfectly. Brandon wants to rewrite Clubs as a woman, and I think that that's fantastic. I think that only would further emphasize the closeness, not in an actual like sexual context or like a gravitation towards each other, but I think that would just create a cohesive choice and narrative there. So I love that pick. That's mine for sure in Era 1. My Era 2 pick is Steris and Wax. It's tough not to, because I do think that finally the one benefit one of the benefits that I give the Lost Metal is all this character work, and it does make them feel like they're in an actual relationship. Steris is worth more than 7%, and she has way more weight in the way that she evaluates things, and it grounds all of the work up until that point, makes it all worth it as it builds. But I have a tough time also not just like swinging at the last second for you, like saying this and being like, yeah, no, you're right. The siblings is way better, because it is. So, yeah. PJ, your Era 1 though.
Mine was Era 1, Season 10.
Oh, sorry, your Era. My bad.
My Era 2 one, I think I'd go from Lost Metal, Wayne and Marasi.
Good pick.
Yeah,
they contrast each other super well. They're both like picking things up from each other, and like really they work so well together. So
yeah,
the biggest bummer of the Lost Metal. Go ahead.
They were great in that. I felt like Marasi did such a good job of giving Wayne a direction for his humor and the way he is, and a natural sense of he could never evolve with Wax, and they did Sanderson did a great job of choosing them to match up together, to have them both progressive. Yeah, that was a great choice, because Wax gets to leave being constable. Wayne gets a bit of grounding. Marasi gets the bit of independence of having someone to back her up, but someone who needs someone to tell him what to do. And they worked so much better. I think that is why the end of Lost Metal doesn't work quite so well, because we lose that great structure that was set up is then kind of gone. And Wayne and Marasi are fantastic.
The story kind of pigeonholes itself in a way where it's like we were set up with this pair, and it feels like we should be sending off that pair, not Wax and Wayne, because they already kind of had ended, not in like a formal way, but Wax was done. He was retiring. And to return to this feels like returning to Wayne being a tool, versus that relationship, PJ, like you'd cited, is more of it's a two-way street. And that feels better than Wayne just being a tool that like Wax is like, yeah, no, I don't, he's a fucking guy on the side that makes shitty jokes, and like, but he's really useful. And that's kind of the way that Wax approaches Wayne, versus Marasi being like, okay, but that's not funny, right? And he's like, well, and she's like, it isn't. And he's like, okay, I'll fix that. I'll adjust. And that's a real partnership versus a maintenance relationship. Yeah. Good picks.
Mm-hmm.
Any final thoughts? Anything on Era 2, Era 1, or things that you want to talk about going into Era 3?
I truly, truly, truly believe, but mostly hope, that Era 3 will make a lot of the shortcomings of Era 2 make sense. That's my hope.
Yeah, this is the interesting thing. I hope that he has to absolutely either nail or abandon. That if he focuses too much on filling in, like not filling in, but associating Era 2 in a way of like making it feel a bit more cohesive, and it doesn't work, then we are going to have poor experience. But if he abandons it, then Era 2 is just going to stay as it is, and it's going to be an interesting line for him to walk in terms of I do believe he can do it, because I think Era 3, the fact that he's writing all three at once, the same way he did the first trilogy, is that he won't have the gaps or releasing a book and then coming back to it and going, I wish I'd done that. It's all three are written, they're all worked on, they're all edited together. They will come out as a cohesive whole. And I think that will, that could only make it stronger. So I have a lot more hope for Era 3.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's pretty clear when he talks about these, at the very least you did at Dragonsteel, where he talked about like the books kind of being written as like pairs, and the Lost Metal pairs with Alloy, and like Shadows and Bands are naturally paired because they were written back to back. Bands being written first technically and then going back to Shadows. So as a duology, those make sense. And as a duology, I can try to make Alloy and Lost Metal make sense. It doesn't, but I can try. And I think that to that point, I agree with you that I think the trilogy will be all the stronger for it. I hope that it tends towards PJ's point of making these dangling plot threads make sense, but I hope that doesn't become a trend going forward. I prefer the complete ending, and I believe that this is a distinct stopping point where it's meant to be unique, and it'll conclude well. I think we got good character conclusions. We just got some mixed plot conclusions. So I think I'm with you both on that. Any other thoughts?
Good.
Dear God, I don't want a Stormlight book like trilogy in the middle between the series. Just let it be. Go into the next thing. Don't do this for that. Let it be planned. Please, I can't. My body can't handle that.
I feel like I'm at the precipice of, I feel like the entire cosmos is a precipice in the sense of directionally that I enjoyed Rhythm of War. I very much am not in the camp of people who don't like war. I thoroughly
really
enjoyed
it too.
But reading Era 2 and that together, I feel like that puts us on the precipice that Tress kind of pulled it back from a little. But it scares me that Tress originally was never meant to be released. Like, from the idea of that was meant to be a little fun thing that he was doing for himself that was never meant to see the light of day. I'm like, no, that's what I want to see.
We want the fun.
Yeah, exactly. Like, pull that in rather than, like, I'm scared that this year will set us up for a fall in the idea of, these are all my fun ideas. And then, like, I feel like my love for
SLA5 is concluding a plot.
Yeah. Like, my love for Sanderson has, it has a certain, it's a very love-hate. Like, there are absolute peaks of Mistborn Era 1, Stormlight Archive, and there are absolute lows of Era 2. I'm not the biggest fan of Warbreaker. I think Elantris is alright. Like, there are massive, I feel like I go from love to and there's never like, oh, that was solidly good. That's what Tress was for me. Like, this was solidly good. And I'm just scared that we're going to slowly drop off, and it's going to be there are more okays compared to greats, because in the recent history, we've seen the each series. If you look at them on average, Mistborn Era 1 is a 10 out of 10 for me. Mistborn Era 2 is a 5 or a 6. And then Stormlight Archive, the first two books to the last, like the third and fourth book, there's a difference for me in terms of the writing. I'm not a big fan of shortening the chapters, etc., which also Lost Metal does. It works better as shortened chapters. But there is a trend towards him not putting out 10s anymore, putting out 6s, 7s, 8s, 8.5s maybe, but there's not those 10s that have been. And I just hope Stormlight Archive 5, Mistborn Era 3, they can just be brilliant. Win me back.
Elantris 2 and 3.
Yeah, like just give me something. Give me something to really pull me back in. And I hope we get that, because it's hard talking to people because people fucking love Sanderson. They love him so much. And I'm just like, I like the guy. I really do. I feel like he's not my favorite author anymore, but I've loved his books. And I feel like You have to either love everything or you're a piece of shit. And I need him to put out.
That is how people treat you, which is bullshit. But yeah.
Yeah. And I'm just like, I need him to put out another great book to get me back to that. And I'm hoping. I live in eternal hope and fear.
Me too, for Stormlight 5. That's why we've delayed it in part, is like, it's got to be way better than the Lost Metal for me to commit a year and a half to covering the series on our show versus like the First Law, where it's like, cool, I know that 9 books are incredible and we're not going to worry about like what's going to happen at a certain point. So yeah, the Lost Metal, rather the Bands of Mourning ending and the Lost Metal brought a little bit of trepidation where it's like, all right, I got to kind of make sure that this is all worth it in the end before we cover a 5-arc series. So I cannot agree with you more. You put it into terms that I'd been wrestling with saying to PJ and otherwise, where it's like, love Sanderson. It is a terrifying beast, though, to like move from him being a 10 out of 10 to like a 7 consistently. And then now with Tress, and I love Warbreaker. So like the standalones are my favorite books, to be frank. Even Elantris is like pretty darn good, but like not number 1 material by any stretch. But yeah, man, it's my thought. PJ, Eras, your future thoughts, predictions, concerns, benefactory thoughts?
I mean, I feel like I covered it pretty well. Like, I just hope it can effectively rectify some of the shortcomings in Eras.
Yeah, right. Naturally. I'm sorry, it circled back. We went so far away that I had to, return.
So I'm not really prepared to go deeper than that.
Sure. All right. Well, cool. Ben, thank you so much for coming onto the show. Again, let people know where they can find you on the interwebs. It'll be in all of our links, of course, so people can find you. But
yes, I have a YouTube channel. I just chat shit on there. Honestly, I disappear sometimes, but I'm back at the moment, and that's all you can ask for. I'm just putting reviews. I'm focusing on reading more diversely, so you won't just get fantasy over there. I'm reading a lot more kind of broader, trying to be a pretentious literature bit. I think I'm doing a hell of a job at it.
Hey, you put out the picture of Dorian Gray last week, and I was like, fuck yeah, one of my favorite classic novels. And I was like, no one talks about this anymore.
Yeah, it's on my syllabus for uni, so and then otherwise I exist in other places. They exist, and it's where everyone else is, Instagram, Twitter, and I just chat shit.
You and Grace have a Discord. Of
course.
Yeah,
Discord. Yeah, I have a Discord. I'm honestly, that's the place I'm most active. We're currently doing a read along. I think. Well, actually, it's only a Patreon thing, but we'll be doing Books of Babel by Josiah Bancroft over there.
Oh no, this is going out. This is going out to everyone. Oh, your Patreon folks.
Yeah.
Books of Babel read along. Yeah.
That will also just be a thing going on. And then I'm reading A Song of Ice and Fire reread after a decade. So lots of fun things
going on. Perfect. There. Sweet. All right. Well, next week we are going to be we hop into the Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee, starting with Jade City, chapters 1 through 9. We've already recorded this episode at this point. I can tell you factually that it is incredible. It was a lot of fun, and I am so excited for where we're going with the show, with everyone that's involved. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. So that's where we'll leave you for this week.
Thank you, as always, to Tim and Andrew for helping us keep the show going. You can check out all of the links in the show notes, including Ben's links. You can find our schedule, our Patreon, previous episodes, websites, social media accounts, all in one very nice, easy, singular location.
Let it be known, too, that we also concluded this week the first season of Catacomb Parties, The Tales of Kana, which is so fucking cool. The full part 2 finale episode is out at this point, so it is very exciting. Or is coming out next week.
Might be coming
out next week. We're there. 14 episodes. It's our incredible drama. Give it a go. It's so good. We melt and die for the amount of work that we do on the show, so we hope that you guys love it. Beyond that, find us Words Whiskey Pod on Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, Words and Whiskey Show, gmail.com. Join us at patreon.com/Words and Whiskey. Our t-shirts for now are on TeePublic. I should be getting that screen printing in the mail soon, PJ, to do evaluations. I couldn't mail it to you because you're leaving. So,
yep. Womp womp.
Bummer. So see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.